Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to our seminar series. Now I actually have a class that has been scheduled at the same time as this, so I'm just actually handed over the moderating duties to my colleague, both at the law school and at Schwartz Reisman, one of our research leads, Lisa Austin. And I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce our speaker today and then keep you all in order. Lisa.
Great, thanks, Jillian. So I'm super delighted to welcome Deborah Hellman to our workshop series. Debbie is the David Lurton Massee Jr. Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. Her two main scholarly interests are discrimination and corruption. She's the author of When Is Discrimination Wrong, as well as the paper A Theory of Bribery, which won the 2019 Fred Berger Memorial Prize from the American Philosophical Association. On the Schwartz Reisman website, we posted a couple additional articles that are related to her talk, one measuring algorithmic fairness, another sex causation and algorithms, which you can take a look at. But I'm super delighted that Debbie is here because, in these discussions of AI fairness, about discrimination, about all the related types of justice questions, often I hear from the sort of tech community, we need to collaborate with people who have sort of domain expertise. And sometimes I feel like people mean a very specific sub expertise, like I want someone who understands, I don't know, Ontario employment law and discrimination or something. And there's really big, important theoretical questions here. Debbie is one of the best theorists on discrimination, period. And that she's wading into the world of big data and AI is great news for everyone who's concerned about these issues. So we're delighted to have her here. She's going to run through one of her papers with some slides, and then we'll open the discussion more generally. My screen is kind of small, so I can't see you all. So if you could use your raise your hand function or the chat function, and I can call on you in the discussion. So I will pass it over to Debbie.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jillian, for inviting me. And that introduction was more than generous and contains some falsities, but I'm going to just accept it and be grateful to be here. So I'm going to share my screen in a minute and talk about the paper Big Data and Compounding Injustice, but I'm happy to talk about either of the other two papers if you glanced at them. And if we run out of conversation about this one, or if anything related to one of the other papers comes up, I'll try to weave that in. Now I am going to share my screen, hopefully. I think that worked, right? Okay, perfect, great. So I'm super excited to talk to you about this paper, and we'll just move it forward. Except, there we go. How come I'm, yeah, okay. Oh, those are the other papers, happy to talk about. Okay, so I'm interested in, when I talk about big data compounding injustice, I want to think about the ways that past injustice can affect the obligations that we have. And so roughly speaking, you could think of injustice as affecting our obligations in three different ways. First, it could create reasons for us to act or duties that we have toward that are forward-looking in orientation, that is, toward creating more just institutions and a just society. Second, we could have obligations to remedy past injustice. So these could be reasons to act or duties that we have to compensate victims of injustice or to remedy the injustice that they have suffered. And third, we could have obligations that are affect how we treat individuals here and now, ways that affect what we do when we interact with victims of injustice. And I consider these, this is the same slide, just with the forward-looking, backward-looking stuff added. The way to think about these different types of duties we may have, given that we live in a world that has injustice and has a lot of past injustice, we might have forward-looking obligations, backward-looking obligations, and present-centered obligations. And what I want to focus on today is the present-centered obligations, This is not to suggest that I don't think there are forward-looking obligations or backward-looking obligations. I do. I just want to isolate a distinct kind of obligation that we might have and ask, when we interact with people who we have reason to believe are victims of injustice, how does that affect what our obligations are with respect to how we engage with them? And I want to make two claims, though frankly, I'm going to spend time on the first one, but I just want to flag the second one. One is a moral claim and one is an interpretive claim. So the moral claim is this: the fact that an action that we take today in the present will compound a prior injustice counts as a distinct reason against doing that action. I want to stress that it doesn't mean that therefore for sure you ought not to do it. There could be reasons that count in favor of doing the action that outweigh the reasons that count against doing the action, but it's a reason that we ought to take account of that belongs in the balance of reasons we consider when we think about what to do. So that's the moral claim. In addition, I have an interpretive claim, and that is, people are worried about AI and big data. So what are they worried about? Well, they're worried about a lot of things. They're worried about privacy. They're worried about accountability. They're worried about fairness and other things. And my claim is broadly in the fairness space. But I think part of what people are worried about when they're worried about fairness, I think that my moral claim taps something of what people are normatively concerned about. That part of what they're worried about is they're worried about the use of big data and AI, that it will compound prior injustice. So that's an interpretive claim, I say, about kind of what's going on in people's minds, what they're really angsting about. And I'm not really going to argue for that claim. I'm just going to appeal to your sense, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong. Do you think that's part of what's bothering people? And I'm going to argue for a principle which I call the anti-compounding injustice principle, or the ACI for short. In the context of a talk, we probably don't need to call it ACI, but in a paper, it makes it easier to refer to. So now I'm going to get into the argument. So when we think about the fact that there's been injustice in the world that may affect, it may affect how our obligations that when we interact with people, I want to flag two types of injustice, or two different ways in which injustice can kind of make its way into the data, if you will. And I call these accuracy affecting injustice and non-accuracy affecting injustice. Now, both are important, and both are ways that decisions based on big data can compound prior injustice. And I'm going to describe each in a minute, but I'm going to emphasize the non-accuracy affecting injustice. And the reason I'm going to emphasize it is because I think accuracy and affecting injustice has gotten much more attention. And so I want to underline the one that I think has been left out, and without good reason. So probably when I go on to describe them, the accuracy affecting injustice is going to be the one that you've heard more about. Okay, so the two examples I have of accuracy affecting injustice that I'm using, and these are just exemplars that I hope ring bells, I'll call biased evaluations and over-policing. So let's take biased evaluations first. Imagine an employer would like to select employees to do some job and uses an algorithm designed to predict job success. To build the algorithm, the employer uses data about features of past employees and information about their success on the job. In order to do that, the designer of the algorithm must determine what are the markers of success on the job. So one possible measure might be, for example, performance reviews by managers. If these managers are biased in their assessments of prior employees, such that they rate, let's say, women employees who perform equally well as men employees as less good, then the data that is the input will be flawed, and this flaw will result from injustice. So that's an accuracy affecting injustice because the data is both affected by the injustice of the biased evaluations, and that injustice creates an inaccuracy. The women really are as good as the men. Now I'm going to describe over policing, another example. So prior crime correlates with future criminal activity, and so data on prior crime might be of interest to police or to sentencing judges or in many contexts, but we can't access prior, we don't know information about prior crime directly. We need some surrogate or proxy for that, and one of which might be arrests for prior crime or arrests and convictions for prior crime. But arrests which can lead to convictions are a product not only of criminal activity, but also of policing practices, which could themselves be unjust. If they are unjust, then using past arrests or past convictions even to predict future crime relies on data that is also flawed due to injustice. So when injustice affects data collection, as in those two examples, it produces error. The women evaluated by the sexist managers are better employees than the data suggests, and reliance on the data thus inaccurately correlates sex and skill. And African Americans, for example, who are over-policed are not more likely to commit crimes than are individuals who are subject to less surveillance, or the differential is less extreme. And reliance on the arrest statistics to predict future crime, therefore overstates the correlation of race and crime. So those are the kinds of examples I have in mind by accuracy affecting injustice. Now, I said this kind of the way this kind of injustice gets into the data is the more familiar. And on the left, we have Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's pretty well known in the United States. And a quote from her, and the quote is, "Algorithms are still made by human beings, and those algorithms are still pegged to basic human assumptions. When they're just automated assumptions, and if you don't fix the bias, then you're just automating the bias." And what we saw in those two examples that I gave you, I think she would call automating the bias. Or another, the second quote is a title, excuse me, from a law review article by Sandy Mason, which she calls bias in, bias out. If you got bias in, it's like garbage in, garbage out. You're going to both have the injustice of the bias, and you're going to have garbage as in inaccuracy. Now I want to describe what I call non-accuracy affecting injustice. So past injustice likely has effects on the world, such that people really do have weaker skills, less wealth, poorer health, etc. Data that accurately reports these traits, that incorporates or reflects that injustice. So injustice can cause data to be inaccurate, like the first kinds of cases, or injustice can cause the traits that the data report. And that is the non-accuracy affecting injustice. Now, the phenomenon of compounding injustice is not new. Data-driven decisions have always compounded both accuracy affecting injustice and non-accuracy affecting injustice. What is new is the scope of these problems. If we're going to have more data and the use of data to make more determinations, then we're going to have more compounding of injustice. And it doesn't mean it wasn't a moral problem before, but it becomes a moral problem that's more insistent as we have more big data driven decisions. So I've talked about the way the two different conceptions of injustice two different types of injustice, and the way that both of those can be, I'll say, metaphorically baked into the data, the kind that affects accuracy and the kind that is not inaccurate, but is just incorporating that past injustice into the data. And now I want to make the case that decisions that compound that injustice raise moral problems. And I want to start to do that by giving you a hypothetical case. And this is meant as an intuition pump. If you think there would be something morally troubling about this, what is it that's morally troubling? And I'm going to then try to extrapolate. If you find it morally troubling, say, well, that's an example of compounding injustice, and then try to extrapolate what I think are the morally relevant features. So here's the example. I call this life insurance and the battered woman. Suppose Amy is a victim of domestic abuse. As a result, she's more likely to die during the upcoming year than a woman who's not an abuse victim. A life insurer calibrating price for insurance policies to the likelihood that the insured will make a claim during the policy period would therefore charge Amy higher rates than and charge Amy and other battered women higher rates than similar others who are not abuse victims. Even if the battered woman leaves her abuser, she's charged higher rates by an insurer focused only on actuarial accuracy, because women who leave are especially at risk of being killed. So if you think there's something morally troubling about such an instance where a woman who's an abuse victim is charged higher rates, what is it that's morally troubling? So I'm labeling this compounding injustice. There's nothing magic about the label, but I want to try to show you what I think are the morally relevant features. And I call it compounding injustice because the word compound has two senses, which will reflect the two morally relevant features I'm going to pick out. And that is, a compound as a noun is a mixture of things, and a compound as a verb, to compound, is to intensify the negative aspects of something. So what I think the two morally relevant features are that the person making the insurer, or the person or institution making the decision is mixing itself sufficiently with the prior injustice that it bears some responsibility, that it or he or she bears some responsibility for the augmenting that comes next. So in this case, the insurer uses Amy's status as an abuse victim as the reason it charges her higher rates. And to my mind, then the insurer engages or mixes itself sufficiently with the prior injustice that it bears some responsibility for what happens. And what happens is that the bad situation is made worse. The insurer makes the injustice worse because not only does Amy now have to suffer the violence that she suffered, but now she has to pay extra for insurance. So the insurer augments the prior injustice. What I want to explore next is how the first element, the mixing element, I think that's the trickier element. That is, in most of the cases that we might think of, the interaction with the past injustice makes that injustice worse. That is, it either entrenches it or it magnifies it. But the question is, what degree of interaction by the actor is sufficient that we want to say to that actor, and you bear some responsibility for that augmenting. In the example of Amy and the insurer, what the insurer did was it actually specifically took her status as an abuse victim as the reason to charge her higher rates. So what I want to ask is that degree of connection necessary, or can we have something a little bit? And to consider that, I want to present to you a second case, which I call employment and unjust educational opportunity. So Aaliyah attended school in a poor neighborhood where the quality of education was weak. The schools were substandard due to an unjust distribution of resources. And I'm assuming these injustices in these cases. As a result, Aaliyah lacks the skills sought by many employers. In this case, the employer doesn't reject Aaliyah because she's a victim of injustice. Rather, it neglects to hire her, or abstains from hiring her, whatever, because she lacks relevant skills. She lacks the relevant skills because of the injustice, but it's a slight step removed from not hiring her precisely because she's the victim of injustice. And so the question I'm asking is, does that fact dilute the employer's responsibility for the harm of being rejected for employment, such that we should say that the employer doesn't bear a responsibility for augmenting it or compounding it? And to my mind, and you'll have to see how the example works for you, the employer still has an obligation in this case. The fact that the employer would be augmenting the injustice does count as a reason to discount her poor skills. And so that leads me to a refinement of my principle of what counts as compounding injustice. So now I would say, when an actor takes the fact of the prior injustice, as in life insurance and the battered woman, or its immediate sequelae, as in employment and unjust educational opportunity, as its reason for action, the actor involves herself sufficiently in the prior injustice to bear some responsibility for any extension of the harm of the injustice that its actions give rise to. Now, I want to emphasize about both of these cases, I've picked ones where I'm assuming that the actor is not responsible for the creation of the injustice in the first place. That is, the insurer is not responsible for the fact that the woman is being abused. And I'm imagining that the employer is not responsible for the fact that Aaliyah has a poor educational opportunity. So it's not, doesn't have that kind of responsibility, but still those are facts about the world. And the question is, what are the moral obligations of the actors, the insurer, and the employer in those instances faced with a person who's suffered an injustice or has some traits that result from prior injustice? And I want to say those facts, the fact that those traits are the result of prior injustice, count as reasons that weigh in the determination of what those actors ought to do. And so when faced with victims of injustice, and I mean this to be both isolated injustice and systemic injustice, other actors have to accommodate that fact, or maybe accommodate isn't the right word, take that fact into consideration, take into consideration the fact that their own actions may deepen or entrench the prior injustice. The decision that the employer or the insurer is faced with is a decision kind of whether to pay it forward, whether to continue or entrench that injustice. So the ACI principle, that's a little slide from the Lorax, which I love, is that compounding injustice is a morally relevant feature of an action. So the fact that your action will compound an injustice is a morally relevant feature of it that should weigh in the balance of reasons considered by an actor. Now, I want to say again, it's a modest claim in the sense that it doesn't mean that you definitely shouldn't do the action. It means it's a reason that ought to count or weigh against doing the action. You have to see what's on the other side, but it's still a morally relevant feature. Now, before I stop, I want to consider two objections. And I'm sure you guys will have more objections, and I look forward to them. But the two I want to consider are, what about misfortune? That is, I'm only talking about a duty not to compound prior injustice. What about when someone has traits based on bad luck? Are those different, and why might they be different? And secondly, what if you don't know that the person's traits result from prior injustice? Maybe it's hard to know in certain circumstances. Do you have to know? That's a pretty demanding standard. Okay, so here's what I have to say about each. about not compounding injustice. What I think about that is I'm not rejecting that we might have some obligations not to compound, misfortune rather. I'm not rejecting the idea that we might have some obligations not to compound misfortune. I don't know. I'm just more confident of the idea that we have a moral obligation not to compound injustice. It strikes me as more insistent or more clear. Whether we want to say something similar about misfortune, I have to think more about. I can see reasons that that is different and reasons that it is similar. It's similar in the sense that the person is similarly kind of suffering, and who wants to pile on suffering? But on the other hand, when you compound injustice, there seems to be kind of an endorsement of the bad thing that happened to the person that doesn't seem to be at issue in the context of misfortune. So I'm interested in whether you guys have similar or different intuitions to the misfortune case, but for now I'll say I just am not addressing that because I don't have clear views about it. And what about knowledge? Do we need, can we know that injustice is the cause of the traits we use in an algorithmic tool? In the examples I gave you, as I said, I assumed that injustice caused the various things. Injustice caused the poor educational opportunity or the poor education, etc. So my view about that is we don't need knowledge. If there's a strong reason to believe that injustice is the cause, that's sufficient. And the weaker the reason to believe that injustice is the cause, the weaker the ACI principle in that case. So it kind of floats along with the strength of how much confidence you have in the fact that injustice was the cause of the traits that you're using. Okay, so now I want to say a little something about the implications for the use of big data and AI. And the two questions I've put up there are, is big data especially likely to compound prior injustice? And maybe these tools hold a promise for avoiding or blocking the compounding of injustice. So as I said, this was my interpretive, well, wasn't my interpretive claim, sorry. As to the first one, I do think that in injustice, big data is especially likely to compound prior injustice. I think we're going to have more of that. It's obviously a speculative claim in that compounding injustice is common and doesn't really depend on sort of fancy algorithmic tools. But to the extent that we're doing more, we're using data about the past and the past which contains injustice more because we have all these tools that allow us to use a lot, bring the kind of wealth of information contained in data to bear, then it's likely we're going to have more compounding injustice. Though I hope we will, in terms of question 2, though I hope we will explore ways that these tools can be used to block or avoid the compounding of injustice, I'm actually skeptical that that's going to be that successful. So I want to give you one more example that makes this point. And that book there has a beautiful cover. There's nothing special about that book. But it's a book that describes the history of race discrimination in lending and zoning in ways that affect the segregation that we see in American cities. So it's just about kind of prior injustice. So it seemed like nice to go with the slide. So here's my hypothetical, which I call lending and prior race discrimination. So Darnell has been discriminated against in his search for employment. When employers see his application, his Black sounding name makes it difficult for him to be called in for an interview. If he does succeed in getting an interview, employers are less likely to hire him than they would be to hire a similarly qualified white applicant because race affects how they perceive his credentials. As a result, Darnell has a lower salary than he would have if race discrimination had not affected his job opportunities. He's seeking a loan to buy a house. A lender, let's suppose, is aware that its prior practice of using income as the central factor in determining whether to issue loans is likely to have a disproportionate effect on Blacks and other racial minorities. So as a result, the lender decides to look for ways to use other factors to predict loan performance. So let's think of some of the other factors that the lender might use. Maybe salary, maybe bill payment, maybe health, maybe marital status. Any of these that the lender might substitute are similarly likely to compound prior injustice. Race discrimination, the race discrimination that led him to have a lower salary also might be lead him to have a lower credit history. It also might affect his loan repayment history. It also might affect his marriage prospects. Men who earn less have a harder time getting married. There's a lot of evidence that race discrimination has a direct impact on health, even not mediated by discrimination in the provision of health services. So anything that we might try to substitute is likely to be part of a web of things that are connected to the prior discrimination that Darnell has experienced. So it's hard to imagine ways that we could disrupt the compounding of injustice by using substitute traits. Now, I don't want to be completely down on this idea. I think we should try to do it. I just think it's going to be a lot harder than we think. And so this is a significant problem that we have to wrestle with. So the implications for tech-focused research would be to be attentive to how big data and machine learning can compound prior injustice, to look for ways, to the extent they're possible, that these tools can be used to avoid or mitigate the harm, and remember that curing inaccuracies in the data will not solve all the moral problems. That accuracy affecting injustice is still going to remain. So the central claim was that compounding injustice matters morally. The fact that an action will compound injustice should count as a reason against doing it. It's a modest claim. It's a reason, but can be outweighed by other reasons. And now I'm going to stop sharing and take your questions.
Thank you, Debbie. That was fantastic. Does anyone want to start off with a question? Okay, Gerald. Oh, sorry, you were clapping rather than having questions. All right. Well, then I get to ask a question. I'm just kind of generally curious about when we think about kind of moral obligations and start from the position. So you start here with a lot of intuitions about someone making a decision about someone else and taking into account different sorts of factors. And then we move to, okay, now we're going to, use data in more sophisticated ways and say machine learning. And that's kind of a scope issue. And I'm wondering if it might actually complicate the story a little bit more, although I'm not sure that it has at the end of the day, has a different outcome. But for example, is it the case that people who make models would have the same moral obligation as the person who's making the decision based upon the model? Or is that do they have a different kind of moral obligation? Or is it an obligation to create a model that could be used in an ethical way? Is that a different thing than the ACI principle as framed here? And on the scope issue, is it just that something like machine learning would make the impact greater, or could it also affect other things? There's a lot in your talk about how what kind of weight to give to this principle is so contextual. It depends on countervailing questions in different contexts. But would you think about that differently if it's about, the impact of a model that's meant to work across multiple contexts in multiple uses? Is that a different kind of scope issue that might lead to a stronger worry to just prohibit it rather than say it depends on the particular use? So I'm just wondering if there's a little bit more that gets complicated when you add something like machine learning into the mix?
Great, thanks. Those are great questions. So in a way, the paper's at a very broad or abstract level, like it's trying to put my finger on something that I think is worrisome about the use of big data to make decisions. And at a very broad level, you'd say data is information about the past. If the past contains injustice, we have to worry about how we use that data to make decisions in the present. But then we're going to have to add nuance to that idea depending on a number of different factors. And one you said is, what are the obligations of the person who creates the model versus the person who uses the model? And my examples are really ones that are focusing on the point of decision, so the person who uses the model. So I guess what I want to say about the model maker is that, you know, guns are used to kill people in bad ways, and they're also used in permissible ways, right? And we might think, well, what are the obligations of a gun maker? Who knows that there are myriad uses that his or her invention or production could be put to. And I think the creator of the model is not creating it just like for fun. It's a product that's going to be, I mean, some of them are created for fun, I guess, right? But I mean, they're often created to be a product that's used in a situation where there are consequences, in a consequential decision-making context. And I think the questions about what are the obligations of the maker, who's not him or herself actually making the decisions, but knows it's going to be used to make decisions, are more analogous in a way to the person who makes a gun. You know, I mean, people raise these questions about nuclear weapons, right? I mean, that like anytime you make something that has potentially troubling uses, you might have some obligation to think about, are you facilitating those uses, et cetera. But that's definitely more attenuated, and those moral questions, I think, are more like other manufacturers of potentially dangerous products, I would say. But then you asked, so I've put forward this idea that it's a reason that counts, and you have to look at, so now we're focusing on the decision maker, the person who's going to use the algorithm to make a decision. And I say it's a reason, the fact that the decision will compound prior injustice, that's a reason that counts against doing it, but you have to see what weighs on the other side. And so then you said, well, that's probably going to be different across different contexts. You know, what kind of a decision is it? What's at stake? What are the concerns on the other side? And I agree with that. And so we probably can't say kind of across the board that, say we have some algorithm that we know compounds X amount of injustice. We can't say you shouldn't use it because you shouldn't use it in context A, but what about context B, which looks different? So I agree, it's a more nuanced analysis that you would have to think about. I think the upshot of the paper is, one, to make us aware of this concern. Two, it's a reason for either in support of certain kinds of legislation or certain kinds of legal treatment of, you know, things that, you know, it's a reason for a law that prohibits risk rating on the basis of abuse victim status, right? It provides support for legislation of that kind. And third, I think I see some interest in the computer science community to try to pursue kind of more that pursuing more accurate decisions, individual fairness, like cases being treated alike, as sufficient to answer the concerns of injustice. And I want to say, well, that's only one half of the injustice, just the accuracy affecting injustice, not the other side. And so it's to kind of push against that movement.
Thanks. I think, Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I really like this. This really helps me think a lot about some of the issues we're talking about. I really like in particular this accuracy versus non-accuracy implication. By the way, I'm sorry for the background noise. I'm picking up my kids.
That's okay.
My car period here. It reminded me a little bit of Friedman and Nissenbaum's bias in computing framework, where they talk about pre-existing technical and emergent bias. And I note a sort of connection, I think, between what you call the accuracy implications and this idea of pre-existing bias. I wonder if you thought about those relations and those other categories of bias?
So, you know, now I'm going to have to say I've seen that and I don't have it fresh in my mind. So I'd have to go back and look at it unless you want to tell me more.
It's just only the way they break it up. And this is from, I mean, this is sort of older work, but I think it serves as the, guys, can you be quiet for a second? Shh. It serves as sort of the beginning of what eventually became this value sensitive design stuff. But basically pre-existing bias is simply the way in which current biases work themselves into computational systems through things like data selection, whereas technical bias tends to be how those systems might overemphasize various types of data. And then emergent bias are sort of unexpected aspects that emerge from the actual way the systems are themselves designed.
So I'm worried that, yeah, I'm going to have to go back and look at that. And that'd be interesting to take into, to kind of map on the different one, when you say it like that, it's not clear to me that, I mean, it seems that all three categories like that could be accuracy affecting, couldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not doing those arguments credit. So I might be sort of overstating some of the accuracy dependent aspects of them. I actually don't want to, I don't know how useful that is. I only highlight it just because it made your work made me think of it. I think the key thing that I'm going to take away from your work though, and it's something I've been trying to think about, is the idea that data accuracy is not enough to verify a lack of, to reduce injustice in these systems. I think that's a very important piece of information.
Thank you. And one thing I'd say is that, and switching from the word bias to the word injustice, I think is important, because bias has in mind like already the idea of inaccuracy, and
absolutely, yeah. Because it moves us from sort of a functional qualification of the system to its actual resulting impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just make a comment? Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand.
Sure.
I was just, I just keep thinking in my mind, this reminds me strangely of the famous Dodge, I think it's Dodge and Ford, the car decision about whether the corporation has to act in the best interests of its shareholders or whether they can make cheap cars to fulfill a societal goal of making cars affordable. And I just, the reason I find it interesting is you say to yourself, okay, so what is the responsibility, let's say, of a corporation for the algorithms that it uses as it relates to societal justice? And so it's kind of interesting to me because I guess in that case, I've always thought that what I took from that case in the end was that it's just too complicated to make corporations make decisions about societal justice, and that those decisions are better made in a different context, and let the corporation do what the corporation is designed to do. So I think it's kind of interesting to think, what can we expect algorithms to do? And to the extent there are limitations, how can we address those limitations outside of that context with another mechanism for correcting those issues?
So I would say, I agree with part of what you said and not part of what you said. So I guess the part I agree with is that it's often impractical and too demanding to say to an entity that is a business corporation, you have to care about something other than your profitability, and we expect you to do that. And also it may be, so that's the impractical, and it may be too demanding in the sense that if no other corporation is doing it and only one is, you might lose, you might go bankrupt or something. Now, actually, in fact, I think the business world is more nuanced. There's a lot of corporations that pursue social goals and they try to actually make that profitable for them by touting their good reputation. So I actually think the situation's more complex than that. But I'm not trying to make an argument about how to operationalize this, whether the best way to operationalize it is to say to corporations, you really have this obligation and, like act on it, or whether that's impractical and too demanding, and instead we should legally require them to do it. That is, it's practical for them to engage in race and sex discrimination, actually often also, outright, straightforward race and sex discrimination, but we prohibit that, or disability discrimination. Often it's quite costly for them to hire disabled workers, and they're not going to do it unless we make them do it, and we make them do it because we think that's what justice requires, but it requires a legal regime so that they're all in the same playing field, so that we're not asking one corporation to kind of stick its neck out. It's actually the legal requirement. So whether the principle I'm arguing for should be operationalized via kind of just a self-executing moral duty that managers should adopt versus a legal requirement, I'm actually not taking a stand on one way or the other. I do agree that there are complicating questions about that.
Nisarg, you're up next.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I may have missed this point, but I was wondering about situations where you may have to compare the moral obligations to different groups. So if there are several different groups that may have suffered prior injustices, and among the models that you have, the reasonable models that you have available to make decisions based on, choosing one model may prevent compounding of injustice to one group, but it may do exactly that thing to another group. How do you kind of compare these moral obligations, and if there's a way to do that in a principled manner?
Yeah, that's a super question, and I guess I don't want to be punting it, but I kind of want to say like that'll have to come next or whatever. Like first, I wanted to convince you there was such a principle, but I think you're absolutely right that we're already having some comparative question like that in the way I've formulated it. That suppose we say, like just to take the battered women example, well, if we don't allow the insurer to risk rate on the basis of abuse victim status, then everybody's insurance is going to go up. So some people, these are not, the other purchasers aren't victims of injustice. They're just ordinary people, non-victims, I guess we'll call them. And so how do we balance their interests against the victims of injustice? So I've already built in that question that there's some balancing, but you're absolutely right that it's overly simplistic in the sense that among different choices, we might be having to choose. Maybe there's no way to not compound injustice, and we have to choose between different forms of compounding. And how should we think about that? I agree. I think those are going to be super complicated. That's not very satisfying, I know.
No, but it's great to know. Yeah, thank you.
Anthony, next.
Thanks, Professor Hellman. So I wondered if I could push you a bit on sort of the question about what makes compounding injustice bad or wrong. I guess that's actually the question. So like at times it seems you want to say that what's bad about it or what makes it wrong to do it is that the agent who's taking another person's prior injustice as a reason to disadvantage them, like involves themselves in that. And so that sounds like a very agent relative constraint, right? I would have thought though that at least pre-theoretically, what's bad about compounding injustice is just the compounding injustice, the agent neutral badness of the fact that injustice is being worse. Someone's already being badly off is being made worse off, independently of the reasons of the perpetrator of that kind of action. So there are two implications for taking this sort of agent neutral view. One might be that the difference between injustice and misfortune doesn't matter as much. Person is just as badly off regardless of whether you are compounding injustice or their misfortune. And I think second, when it comes to talking about the law, so I think that generally speaking, outside of the criminal law, the law is more sort of cares less about what the reasons of that people have for acting, as opposed to preventing like bad effects of people's actions. So it seems to me that there are two advantages for taking the sort of agent neutral view, and I wondered whether whether you came down on one side or more, or whether you disagreed with my.
I love that question. Great question. Thank you. So I think, and this does get to where I am with injustice versus misfortune. I think, any kind of prioritarian sort of view that cares about, the well-being of the least well-off is going to care about both the victims of injustice and misfortune. I mean, people who are bad off, we don't want them to be worse off, right? And I think there is that in both cases, that we don't, making a bad situation worse is not good, right? So in that kind of agent neutral way, I would agree with that. But I do want to argue for, in addition, not that that isn't true, but in addition, for agent relevant reason, which is why the mixing element is the key, because then on the agent neutral way, you don't need the mixing, right? It's just the augmenting part that's doing all the work. So when you involve yourself in a situation, I think it creates obligations. It sort of reminds me of, how when medical researchers go into places where there is not adequate healthcare and they're engaging in some research, one question that often gets asked is what kind of obligations ancillary obligations they have to attend to the health of the people who are the research subjects. And there is a way in which, now that one you could say they're using them in a way, but so it's not quite a use idea, but when you involve yourself in somebody's situation, you have obligations that are specific to you. And so the worsening of the injustice is on you in some way, that I do want to argue for as an agent-centered, an agent-relative reason. Now, I can see that that's the part that many people may not buy, right? And I think the other, and that's why I said I'm not rejecting. Like, I think that there could be an argument about compounding misfortune that's also kind of irrespective of your mixing yourself within it. You don't want to augment misfortune. But I think there's a special reason that comes into play when you involve yourself with the injustice that constrains how you then interact with that person. Now, the question you might say is, well, why when you involve yourself with injustice? And so something about it being injustice rather than misfortune creates that link to me. But I clearly, from the skepticism on your face, I need to say more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, less skepticism, more also sharing puzzlement. But I think that I find it more plausible to sort of talk about the agent relative badness of discriminatory acts as a purely moral matter. But maybe you can just sort of say a bit more about why the law should be involved in that. So like part of, I think, what you want to capture with your refinement, right? So the idea that, taking a proxy trait as a reason is just as bad, is that you can capture indirect discrimination. So maybe not as much in the US, but in a lot of jurisdictions, I guess I would have thought that what's bad about indirect discrimination is the effect, disproportionate effect on people, and not so much the reasons of the discriminator in that case. So maybe just generally, even if we agree that the agent relative view is a kind of good moral view, why should that sort of impact the way we think about the law?
So the second question about is the account I'm providing either a good fit for existing law, and is it justificatory of existing law, I think are going to be different for different legal systems. And maybe I'm overly influenced by the US legal system such that it matters in the US legal system, the reason for action much more than it does in the Canadian legal system. So maybe I'm overly influenced by that, though I don't think that's a good feature of the American legal system, so I shouldn't be. This may be a case of just conflicting intuitions. That's what I'm wrestling with is, do I just have an intuition that it's an obligation that falls particularly on you as an agent because you're compounding the injustice, rather than just it being a bad thing that that someone who's suffering is worse. I don't know. I'll think more about that.
Hey, Daniel, you're next.
Thank you. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. So as I was listening to you talk, one thing that I started to really think about was specifically movements in the UK, or rather in Europe, and now some kind of conversations in America around ownership of data. So individuals having more right to own their own personal data, and to be forgotten by these systems. Do you think that is this going to be part of these kind of discussions around dealing with these issues of injustice, of being I want to be forgotten by the systems. I don't want my data to be used in these systems so that they cannot compound these injustices? Is this going to be part of the legal frameworks that we're going to have to start developing? Or I'm just kind of curious about your perspective around this idea of data ownership as it relates to these issues of data injustice.
So I hadn't thought about that at all. So what I'm going to give you is a totally off the cuff response. But my first line intuition about it is that it may not be relevant because it's not the data, it's the facts in the world, right? The data is just reporting the facts in the world. And if the data forgets that you have poor skills, 10 years later, when you go for the job, you still have poor skills, unless somehow you manage to not be. So I suppose in instances where either the person manages or we have social interventions that change the trajectory of people's lives in meaningful ways so that they no longer their past self is not that predictive anymore, but now we're going to have that's going to be accuracy affecting injustice, right? So so yes, that would be, I suppose, it won't change things for the non-accuracy affecting injustice, but it would for the accuracy affecting injustice, because we have to envision that your past self isn't predictive of your present self for the forgetting to help you, right?
Yeah, I'm just kind of fascinated by that as a perspective of kind of collective action as a way of trying to address this. As we often feel very underpowered, or these systems are predicting our futures and our pasts and all these other things. And is there some way that we can collectively engage in some kind of action to try and reclaim something? And I was just kind of curious about the way that this all kind of connects together within that kind of legal structure of ownership of data and stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting in the sense that even if we change, if our data is still haunting us, then we're not allowed to actually change. And so what strikes me immediately is it sounds like a autonomy issue more so than a kind of injustice issue. It's less of a fairness issue and more of an autonomy issue. But but that's interesting.
Thanks.
Other hands or questions in the chat? I don't see any questions in the chat. Well, then I get the chair's prerogative, so I have my list of questions. And Debbie, I was just wondering, it was more of an invitation than a question, but I can frame it as a question. It was just to talk more about how you see what you're talking about with the ACI principle as being distinct from, say, this backward-looking compensatory obligation and the forward-looking, just society kind of position. Because one way you might think about compensation, like I was thinking of your example of, someone who is less skilled and so they don't necessarily get the job, and that compounds the injustice that led to them being less skilled. If you were going to compensate them for the injustice of being less skilled, you might think that actually the best compensation is to give them the job they would have had they been more skilled, because if you were just compensating them with, say, money, it's not going to get at all those aspects of the job that aren't really about just, say, income differentials. It's about, your social standing and anyway, various things that you can spin out about the actual having of the job. So it looks like actually that's the best way to compensate someone, in that in some sort of narrow set of circumstances, it might be, the obligation of the particular employer rather than some kind of broader social obligation. But you're saying, no, this is like very distinct from that compensatory. And so I'm just kind of curious as to hearing a little bit more about why.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I think maybe part of the kind of motivation about that is you might think, if someone's been a victim of prior injustice, let's say the poor education, and now I'm the employer, I can recognize that as a member of society, like I have some, society should compensate this person for the poor education. But if I have to be the one that offers the full compensation, it seems unfair that why does it fall all on me? There's all those other people out there who aren't participating in paying their share of that compensation. And I think that's what, in the context of, like, you might say, well, that's why, in addition to reasons of efficiency, that's why it shouldn't be a reason to give someone a job. Rather, society ought to do something, like if they make me give her the job, they better pay her salary, or they should give her job training or what have you. But it's not going to be something that's going to fall on me, because my contribution to the responsibility for the backward-looking injustice is only one piece. And as a member of society, it's going to be a small piece. So there's going to be no reason for me to act differently other than to vote for politicians that recognize the compensatory obligation, or to support charitable institutions that try to provide what the person would get as in a compensatory model. And similarly with the forward-looking obligation, I have an obligation as a member of society to work for more just institutions, et cetera, et cetera. But neither of those provide a reason for me to do something differently now in hiring. And the present-centered, agent-relative reason, I think, gives me a reason to hire someone who's less qualified. Now, not someone who's totally unqualified, because my interests also count. So it's probably only working at the margin, people who are less qualified, but still, enough to do the job. It's not going to probably serve that person, or it's asking too much of me for me to hire someone completely unqualified. So in a way, it's provides a justification for a kind of affirmative action that we're familiar with. That is hiring someone who is slightly less qualified when you think that the reason is due to injustice. And it provides the moral grounding that's different from those other rationales for something that I think we actually do think, which is maybe that person has an obligation to act here and now, not just to vote for politicians that support job training and stuff like that.
Thanks, that's helpful. Are there other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was really interested in this notion you brought up about not having the need to know for sure what injustice compounding algorithmic tools may have built into them, but just having a sort of need to reasonably believe, or the stronger you have those beliefs, the more your ACI principle should take effect, right? So I guess my question is, and I'm not an expert in law or ethics or any of those things, but I guess my question is, from a practical example, how are the people who might be entrusted with implementing these new kinds of AI tools in places like a life insurance company supposed to know how much they should or shouldn't believe the tools are likely to compound injustice? And especially, as you probably know, a lot of what we talk about with AI is the lack of explainability and the black box problem and things like that. So I guess I'm thinking more from like the perspective of, say, a person who works at the life insurance company who isn't a computer scientist, but who is entrusted with hiring a third-party developer to implement these tools, and how much, I guess maybe, I don't know if it's more of a question of how much should we trust our own beliefs, but yeah, I hope that's,
Yeah.
is that kind of.
So, I mean, maybe this makes the paper sound boring, but what I think is that this provides a new principle for things that are familiar. That is, when we want to implement things in law and policy, we have to pick broad categories. We're not going to say, okay, here's the legal principle. Each person should try to figure out how much actual injustice they're compounding against unique, specific other individuals, because that's just not plausible, right? Rather, we, as a general matter, say you should care about the fact that your policy has a disparate impact on previously disadvantaged groups. Why? Those are groups that likely suffered prior injustice, right? So it gives a justification, a new or different justification for familiar practices that we have, but it's a different justification. But it's not gonna, I wouldn't expect it to happen. Like, I do give examples that are like very person to person, but I don't, with like Aaliyah and the hiring, that was really meant as an intuition pump, rather than that's how it's going to happen. That I would expect the employer to find out, well, where did you go to school? And, so what I'm really looking at is broad categories of people that every single one of them may not have suffered injustice, but the law has to, or policies that are social policies, have to draw broad categories to effectuate anything. So the question is, what's the moral principle that justifies those practices?
Right, thanks.
Other questions? Before the talk, Debbie and I were talking about, she's done some really interesting work. I don't know how many people got a chance to read her other paper on measuring algorithmic fairness, which takes on another set of issues in this family of issues, but different from this ACI principle. And we discussed that it's better to kind of separate the two, just because they were a different kind of issue. But I wondered, Debbie, if you wanted to say a bit about that work as well, because I think a lot of people in this this virtual room anyway would find that a super interesting project as well.
I'd be delighted to. So I'll talk for a little bit, and then I'll open it back up. I'm going to put my screen share back on, if you don't mind, because it'll help me to do that. Let me see if I can advance. Have I screen shared with you? I have, right? Okay. So I'm going to skip this slide. There's okay. Well, I guess I should back up. So there's a debate in kind of the computer science and policy literature about what happens when you have an algorithm that produces errors in two different kinds of ways. Let me actually, I want to. Okay, so this is the paper I'm talking about. We'll start with this. The paper is called Measuring Algorithmic Fairness, and so it asks what does fairness require in the context of algorithmic decision making, because there are different ways we can conceptualize what fairness is. And this paper has three aims: one's conceptual, one's normative, and one's legal. And I'm just going to talk to you about the first one, but I'll just tell you what the claims are in case you're interested to read the paper. So the conceptual claim is that of these different measures of fairness, and I'll say a little bit more about what they are in a minute, but the two dominant ones are called predictive parity, and that is that a score means the same thing for two relevant groups, let's say blacks and whites, men and women, and equal predictive value is another way to capture that. Sorry, I'll compare that to another way in a second, but that relates to questions about belief, about what we ought to believe, and therefore isn't relevant to questions of fairness. So that's the conceptual claim. And that different false positives and false negative rates, so the other way of thinking about fairness has to do with whether you have the same false positives and false negative rates. And if you're confused already, to some of you this is super familiar, to others it's confusing, and I'm going to get into it. This is the moral claim that that's suggestive of unfairness. And the third is the legal claim that sometimes the use of racial classifications within algorithms doesn't constitute disparate treatment in US constitutional law. And you guys are going to be uninterested in that claim probably. Okay, so algorithms are used to make, let's say, consequential decisions like who gets a loan, who gets released, who gets an interview. All right, there was this huge controversy about an algorithm called Compass that was used to predict recidivism, and it was used pretty frequently in many parts of the country, sometimes in the context of granting parole, sometimes in the context of granting bail, and sometimes even in the context of sentencing. And this is the front page of an expose by the website ProPublica that claimed that the algorithmic tool Compass was biased. And the claim that they made was in forecasting who would reoffend, the algorithm made mistakes with black and white defendants at roughly the same rate, but in very different ways. The formula was particularly likely to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this way at almost twice the rate as white defendants. White defendants were mislabeled as low risk more often than black defendants. That was the claim. And what's interesting is that the company, which used to be called North Point, that made the algorithm actually agreed largely with the accusation, just had a different take on what it signified. So the charge by ProPublica was that a black person who did not go on to recidivate was much more likely to be scored as high risk than a white person who did not go on to recidivate, okay? But North Point said a black person and a white person who with the same score are equally likely to recidivate. That is, they're pointing to different features of the way the similarities and differences that the algorithm produced. A way to state that is to say that one measure begins with the score and asks about its ability to predict reality. This is how North Point addressed the question, that a black person and a white person with the same score are equally likely to recidivate. Ask about the score and its ability to predict reality. ProPublica focused on a different measure. The other measure begins with reality and asks about its likelihood of being captured by the score. So a black person and a white person who don't recidivate, how likely are they to have been scored as accurately as low risk by the algorithm? So they're focusing on different questions. And the dilemma created by this controversy was that, except in super unusual situations, it's impossible to have parity, to equalize blacks and whites, let's say, in both dimensions. Therefore, creating the question, what does fairness require in this context? That the score is means the same thing, that if you have the score, it's equally likely to predict reality, or that if you start with reality, the two people from the two groups are equally likely to have been characterized appropriately by the score. So if you're having trouble getting your mind around that, I'll just say I had to sit with this for a super long time because I'm not a computer scientist. So I created this little hypothetical that illustrates it. And the hypothetical, in my hypothetical, we have two groups, the greens and the blues, and we're dealing with a test that predicts whether they're sick or healthy. So in the test, for the greens, so now I'm looking at the far left, if a sick green, 60% of sick greens got a positive. So of the people who got a positive result, so we're talking start with the score and look at its ability to predict reality. So people who got a positive result who are green, 60 of them really are positive, but 20 of them got a false positive. 20 of them are not sick. So 60, the accuracy rate is 60 out of 80, and that's roughly similar to what happened with the blues. If you got a positive result, 16 out of 20 who got the positive result for the blues also are sick. So it's got equal predictive value for the greens and the blues. So this just says what I said a moment ago, the probability that a green person is sick if she tests positive is 60 out of 80, and it's almost the same for the blues. So the predictive value is roughly equivalent. Now you compare that, this is the same chart, just looking down instead of across. If you're a sick person and you're green, what's the likelihood that the test pops out as result of sick? 60 out of 66. So it's pretty accurate for the greens. But for the blues, it's not so accurate if you're sick. 16 got a true positive, but 22 got a false negative. So it's not such an accurate test if you're sick for the blues, okay? So what happens is that the errors, the errors produced by the test are of very different types. Greens are much more likely to get false positives, and blues are much more likely to get false negatives. So how should we think about that? Which matters? Predictive parity, that a positive score is equally predictive, or error rate balance, that the false positive and false negative rates are equal. So another way of stating that is what matters, that if a blue person and a green person get a positive score, they're equally likely to be sick, or is what matters, a sick green and a sick blue are equally likely to be scored sick by the test, okay? So what I want to claim is that the measure North Point focused on, predictive parity, that's the meaningfulness of the score, that's relevant to the question of what should I believe, not for the question, what should I do? And therefore is not as relevant to fairness issues, because when we're thinking about fairness, we're thinking about action, not belief. So what is predictive parity? It means that a score produced by the algorithm means the same thing, irrespective of the group to which the person belongs. And why does that matter? Because if without predictive parity, if you don't know whether the person is a green or a blue, black or white, man or woman, whatever the groups, you don't know what the score really indicates. But that is often not relevant for action. So this is kind of familiar territory, but I'll just give an example. This example I call Leslie the baby and the bat, because I had a friend who this really happened to. So Leslie woke up one night and there was a bat flying around her house. And she had a new young baby, and the baby hadn't woken up or cried or anything, but she worried about it. And so she called her pediatrician and she said, you know, what do you think about this situation? And he said to her, look, it's highly likely there's nothing to worry about, because very few bats these days carry rabies. And if the bat did happen to have rabies and bit your daughter, it's incredibly likely that your daughter would have woken up and cried, and she had a baby monitor and everything. So the fact that that the baby didn't cry out, I'm almost certain the baby doesn't have rabies. But here's what I want you to do. Come into the office and we're going to give the baby rabies shots. So why? Because the costs of an error are so high. If the baby had rabies and you don't treat the baby for rabies right away, the baby can die. So given this evidence, what should I believe is that the baby does not have rabies. But given this evidence, what should I do? Treat the baby for rabies. The other example I have is the classic legal case that, you presented evidence that John punched Bill, and what should you do? Well, that depends on whether you're in a civil case or a criminal case. Let's say you think it's 75% likely that John punched Bill. Given this evidence, you believe that John punched Bill. What should you do? Well, if it's a criminal case, you're going to let him go free. If it's a civil case, you're going to hold him liable. So what you should do depends on what the costs of the different kinds of errors are. What does this tell us about this situation? That, remember, one of those measures focuses on whether the score means the same thing for the two groups. That's going to tell you, if you don't know whether the score means, a high score really means the same thing for the blues and greens, you don't know exactly what to believe about whether the person is sick. So it relates to belief. But for what you should do, you need to know what kind of error you might make and what the cost of those and what the cost of those errors are. And because costs of false negatives and false positives are often very different, it matters whether you're more likely to have a false positive or a false negative. Those different errors carry different, are different. So fairness, treating people fairly, the action question is the error rates matter more. But really that isn't even the oomph of the claim here. Is just that predictive parity just doesn't tell you anything about fairness. It tells you something in the space of belief. And therefore, if we're asking which of those measures was more relevant to fairness, we're going to push out predictive parity because it relates to questions of belief rather than to action. And I know I'm almost out, so I'm going to stop my screen share now. That was the first part of the paper, and the normative part comes second, about how to think about error rates and fairness. And I would love any thoughts you have in our remaining time, or you can email me if you read the paper. It's available on SSRN, or you can get it on my webpage, or I'll send you a copy.
Also on the SRI webpage.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's an awesome paper. Are there questions?
Sorry, that was super quick and maybe a little too cursory.
All of questions. Hi, Deborah. I really enjoyed your talks, and both halves of it. On the second part of it about predictive parity, I'm thinking that if so the focus is on kind of the action rather than belief, and that's why predictive parity you're saying isn't a good measure of fairness. But in many real situations, I think that the role of the model is to come up with some sort of score, and then there's a human decision maker on the other side. And so the model, in some sense, its input stops at the point of producing a score. And so I would think that if we want, that would be an argument to say predictive parity would be relevant in those kinds of situations, because it's producing some sort of score. You'd like that score to be equally meaningful for both groups. And so that does relate to fairness in the sense that if those scores are being used by a decision maker, then it potentially does impact fairness. So I wonder what your reaction to that.
So it depends on how you're framing the question. If you want to say, look, the point of the model is to tell you what to believe, not what to do. Is that an accurate restatement of your point?
Yeah, and in many cases, yeah, the point of the model isn't the ultimate decision maker. So it's not it's suggesting what you should do, but the decisions are being made by a human, let's say. So
well, where I was going to go was somewhere different, but I'll have two responses. One is, when you say it's suggesting what to do, then it's really not operating just in the space of belief, because even if there's a human decision maker, it's not. If there's two human decision makers and one saying one has the ultimate authority, that's where the buck stops. But if I'm the underling and I tell my boss, I think you should do A, and he can or she can override me, I'm still speaking in the domain of action if I'm suggesting what to do, even if that other person can override me. So it's not about whether there's a human there. It's about, are we talking about what to do, or are we talking about what to believe? So if we're talking about what to do, I don't think predictive parity is the right measure. But I'll say something even stronger is, if you came back and you said, okay, I'm going to modify and say, the model's just telling you what to believe. It's not telling you what to do at all. It's not even suggesting what to do. It's just telling you what to believe. Then you still shouldn't say predictive parity is the right measure of fairness, because what I want to say is fairness is a concept that relates to action. And so, like predictive parity is the right measure with regard to, like, it's an epistemic measure about making sure we believe accurate things. It's not a measure that's about fairness. So if we're asking the question, I take the question posed by that dilemma to be, which is the better measure of fairness? And what I want to say is predictive parity isn't a fairness measure.
Okay. I mean, I would think that predicting, so with the loan example, just to push on that example a little bit, right? So the predictive parity is saying, what is the probability that this person is going to default on a loan, let's say, right? And so the decision maker is deciding what to do with that information, right? When to grant the loan or not. And so it seems that if you can make if the first part of it, the kind of score that's produced by the model is valid, right? And valid could be that it's equally, like you said, it makes the same kinds of mistakes on both groups. Then it's, yeah. So I guess it's the line to me between deciding, a belief versus an action. This is somewhere in between, and so that's it's not as black and white to me that it's it's what the person decides to do with the default. The probability of defaulting on a loan is obviously the action, but this is closer to an action than a belief. Let's say.
Right, but the question is, so then the it's, as you said before, suggesting what to do, but the measure, like if I told you, I've got a measure that tells me, forget even the comparative aspect. See, I think what trips us up is the comparative aspect, but I've just got a measure that tells you how accurate the score is, okay? Forget comparative between groups, just in general. Mm-hmm. I have a measure that tells me how accurate the score is. You wouldn't call that a fairness measure. You'd call that a measure of like how good the data is, right?
Yeah.
And now I have a comparative accuracy measure. The fact that it's comparative is what I want to say. It tells me how accurate the data is for one group compared to the other, but that doesn't necessarily make it a measure of fairness. So the measure isn't about what to do. Predictive parity is about the accuracy. Is the data equally accurate for, equally predictive for one group as another? And I just want to say that's just not that tells me I don't say it's unimportant, it's super important, and it's relevant to what I ought to believe about the data, but it's not a fairness measure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I could follow it up a little further, but I'll let somebody else chime in.
Well, we're actually out of time, but I encourage everyone to read those papers and follow up privately with Debbie. I just had one announcement that I was asked to make, which is next week's seminar is Peter Lowen from U of T. He's going to be presenting on 4 barriers to algorithmic government, and you can find more details of it on the website. So join me in thanking, oh yes, Debbie, you had one
I
announcement.
had
sorry.
one announcement I forgot
Yeah.
to make. So the Data Science School at UVA, which is a new school, is looking to hire a chair of responsible data science. And it's an exciting position for a new school that would, create the program. And if you or anyone you know is interested in this job, you can email me. I'll send you the link to the site, and I would encourage you to spread the word. And thank you so much for inviting me. This has been super fun. And I'm sorry I'm sorry if I was too argumentative in that last bit.
No, not at all.
No, it's just getting good. Thank you, Debbie, and join me in thanking her for a great
Thank you
presentation.
very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.